I want you to picture this. You are sick, burning up, barely able to stand on your own 2 feet, and the one person driving you to get your medicine is quietly planning to make sure you never take it. That is exactly what happened to me on a freezing night in Vancouver, and I did not find out until a stranger behind a pharmacy counter stopped me in a parking lot and changed the entire course of my life. Before I tell you how it ended, let me tell you how it started, because you need to understand exactly how much I gave before I understood exactly how little it meant to some people. I spent decades believing that if you loved your family enough, gave them enough, sacrificed enough, they would never turn on you. I was wrong, and it nearly cost me everything. If you are new here, welcome, and if this story pulls you in the way I think it will, stick around until the end, because the ending is the part people never forget. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next time, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. My name is Gordon Whitlock. I am 68 years old, a widower, and for most of my adult life I measured my own success by how well my family was doing, not by how well I was doing. My wife Margaret passed away 11 years ago after a long battle with cancer, and after that, my son Connor became the center of everything I did. Raising him alone was not easy, but I never let him feel the absence of anything. I worked long hours at a construction firm here in Vancouver for over 30 years, and every extra dollar I earned went toward giving him a better life than I had growing up. I paid for his college in full, no loans, no debt hanging over his head when he graduated. When he met a woman named Brianne and they decided to get married, I covered a large portion of the wedding costs without a second thought. When their apartment lease ended a few years later and money got tight for them, I did not hesitate. I told them my door was always open, no conditions attached. For 3 years, Connor and Brianne lived with me in my house just outside the city, and I covered every single bill without complaint. Groceries, utilities, insurance, property taxes, all of it fell on my shoulders. I told myself that this was what family meant, that love given freely would always come back around eventually. Looking back now, I can see how easily people can take generosity for granted once it becomes routine. In the beginning, Connor and Brianne thanked me constantly for letting them stay. They offered to help with chores, offered to contribute money here and there, and I always waved it off, telling them to save their own paychecks for their future. Slowly, over months and then years, the thank yous became less frequent. The offers to help stopped altogether. I did not mind at first, because I told myself that is simply what happens once people settle into a comfortable routine with family. I believed that with my whole heart, right up until the night that fever hit me and changed how I saw everything. It was late January, bitter cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and settles there no matter how many layers you wear. I woke up in the middle of the night soaked in sweat, my head pounding like there was a drum inside my skull, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I knew immediately that something was seriously wrong, worse than an ordinary cold or flu. I checked my temperature and it was dangerously high. I dragged myself down the hallway to Connor and Brianne's door and knocked, my hand trembling against the wood. I told them I needed to get to the pharmacy before it closed for the night, that I could not drive myself in this condition. I remember standing there in the doorway, barely able to keep my balance, practically begging them to take me. Connor glanced up from the television for maybe 2 seconds, waved me off, and told me to wait until the next commercial break. Brianne did not even look up from her phone. I stood in that doorway feeling more alone than I had felt in years, watching the glow of the television flicker across their faces while I could barely hold myself upright. It was not the fever making me weak in that moment. It was the sudden, sinking realization that the two people I had given absolutely everything to could not be bothered to give me 10 minutes of their evening. I remember gripping the doorframe just to stay upright, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me, while the sound of canned laughter drifted out from the television behind them. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned around, walked back to my room, and sat on the edge of my bed trying to decide whether I should attempt the drive myself, fever and all, rather than ask them again. Something in me broke that night, and in a moment of exhaustion, fear and hurt, I said something I probably should have kept to myself. I told them exactly what I was worth on paper, as if the number alone might finally move them to help me. A house valued at roughly $450,000. $200,000 sitting quietly in savings, built up over decades of careful work. The words were barely out of my mouth before I watched their faces change right in front of me, like a switch had been flipped somewhere behind their eyes. Connor stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his drink on the coffee table. Brienne rushed to my side almost instantly, asking if I needed water, if I needed a blanket, if I was comfortable enough to sit down. Their sudden concern should have felt comforting after minutes of being ignored. Instead, it felt like ice water running down my spine, because I recognized the shift for exactly what it was. This was not love finally finding its way back to me after years of quiet neglect. This was greed waking up the moment it heard a dollar figure attached to my health. To my surprise, Brienne offered to drive me to the pharmacy herself, grabbing her keys before I could even finish getting my coat on. I was too sick and too tired to think much of it at the time. I just wanted my medicine and my bed. But the drive there felt strange from the very first mile. She kept asking questions that had absolutely nothing to do with my health or how I was feeling. Who was named in my will? How exactly my savings were split between accounts? Whether the house would automatically go to Connor if something happened to me, or whether there was paperwork involved. I answered a few questions out of politeness, mostly because I did not have the energy to argue, before I finally told her I would rather focus on getting inside before the pharmacy closed for the night. She apologized quickly and dropped the subject, but something about the entire conversation sat wrong with me, an unease I could not quite name. I chose to blame it on stress, on exhaustion, on my own fevered imagination running wild, because the alternative explanation was too painful for me to consider at the time. I did not yet know how right my instincts truly were. I remember watching the streetlights pass over her face in the dark car, noticing how her tone stayed calm and pleasant even as the questions grew more pointed, as though she had rehearsed the entire conversation before we ever left the driveway. We made it inside with only a few minutes to spare before closing. The pharmacist filled my prescription for antibiotics, and while we waited, I realized I had left my wallet in the car in my rush to get out the door. I stepped back outside to grab it, telling Brienne I would only be a moment. Those few minutes outside were all it took. When I came back in, everything looked completely normal. Brienne smiled, handed me my paper bag, and told me she was glad we made it in time before the doors locked. I thanked her, still feeling weak and foggy, and we started walking back out toward the car. That is when a pharmacist named Kevin came jogging out into the parking lot behind us, calling my name, asking me to wait just a moment. He looked shaken, his expression tight with something between concern and disbelief. He pulled me aside, away from Brienne, and quietly told me he had watched on the store's security cameras as she opened my medication bag near the front counter and swapped my antibiotics for a completely different set of pills. He had the real, correct prescription ready in his hand, and he told me flatly, without any hesitation in his voice, that what he witnessed did not look like an innocent mistake. He explained that he had been reviewing the footage from earlier in the day for an unrelated inventory issue when he happened to catch the moment on a different camera entirely, purely by chance, and that he felt an obligation to say something the second he realized what he was looking at. His hands were still slightly unsteady as he spoke, as if he understood exactly how much this small act of honesty was about to change my life. I stood in that parking lot holding the real medicine in my shaking hands, trying to process what I had just been told over the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. The woman who had married my son, who had lived under my roof for 3 years, eating meals I paid for and sleeping under a roof I maintained, had tried to swap out the very medication meant to save my life. Kevin offered to call the police right there on the spot, his phone already halfway out of his pocket. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to let the consequences fall exactly where they belonged. But I was exhausted, still sick, and honestly still in a fog of shock that made it hard to think clearly. I asked him for a little time before deciding what to do next. He respected that without pushing, though he made it clear he was willing to testify to exactly what he saw whenever I was ready to move forward. I went home that night and quietly took the correct medicine, and I did not sleep more than an hour, staring at the ceiling in the dark, wondering how someone could sit across from me at dinner, smile at me, and still be capable of something like this. Once I recovered enough over the following days to think clearly, I made a decision. I was not going to scream. I was not going to throw accusations across the dinner table in a fit of rage. And I was not going to let this turn me into someone I did not recognize. I was going to be smart about this instead. I called my attorney and scheduled an appointment for the very next morning. I sat in that office for nearly 2 hours and rewrote my entire will from top to bottom. Every asset I owned, the house, the savings, all $450,000 in property and $200,000 in cash, would now go to a group of veterans charities across the country instead of to Connor and Brianne. It felt strange signing those papers, knowing I was cutting my own son out of the future I had spent his whole life building. But I reminded myself, page after page, that this was never really about the money in the first place. It was about who had actually earned the right to be trusted with the life I had spent decades building brick by brick. My attorney, a patient woman who had handled Margaret's estate years earlier, asked me twice if I was certain, and both times I told her I had never been more certain of anything in my life. A few days later, once the paperwork was finalized and safely filed with my attorney, I called Connor and Brianne into the living room and asked them both to sit down. I told them, calmly and without raising my voice, that I knew everything. I told them about the security cameras, about Kevin, about the swapped pills sitting in that pharmacy bag. Brianne's face went completely white, the color draining from her cheeks in real time. She tried to deny it at first, stumbling over her own words, but once I mentioned the footage and Kevin's willingness to speak to the police if it came to that, she broke down completely. She admitted, through tears, that she and Connor were drowning in roughly $50,000 of debt they had never once mentioned to me, and that somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that my death would solve their financial problems faster and more permanently than my continued life ever could. Connor sat frozen beside her on the couch, staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes even once during the entire conversation. I asked him directly whether he had known what she was planning, and he swore he had not, though I noticed he never once defended her actions or asked me to reconsider on her behalf. I sat there in silence while Brianne cried and apologized, because there was truly nothing left to say that would undo what she had tried to do to me. I told them plainly that they would inherit nothing, not one single dollar, and that they had exactly 7 days to find somewhere else to live. Connor finally seemed to understand the full weight of what greed had turned his wife into, and honestly, what it had quietly turned him into as well, given how easily he had ignored me the night I stood in his doorway begging for help. Brianne pleaded with me not to call the police, her voice breaking with every word, and in the end, I chose not to press criminal charges. But I made one thing unmistakably clear to both of them before they packed their final boxes and left. Forgiveness does not erase betrayal, and it never will, no matter how many apologies follow it. A week later, I stood on my front porch and watched their car disappear down the street for the last time. I closed the front door behind me and felt something I had not felt in years, a deep and quiet peace, standing alone in a home that was finally free of manipulation and deceit. I started planning the trip to Europe I had been putting off for over a decade, folders of brochures spread across my kitchen table for the first time in years. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the rest of my life actually belonged to me again, and to no one else. If this story affected you the way it affected me telling it, let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story like this one.